A hotel housekeeper found $180,000 in a laptop bag left in room 412. The cash was bundled in rubber bands, 3 stacks of 60,000, each one sitting inside a leather briefcase beside a MacBook Pro and a business card that read Harlan Voss, Chief Executive Officer, Voss Capital Partners. She didn't call the front desk. She didn't pocket a single bill. She sat down on the edge of the unmade bed and stared at more money than she'd earned in the last 14 years combined. And what she decided to do next would cost her the job she couldn't afford to lose, expose a secret her employer had buried for a decade, and force a man who'd built his fortune on distrust to ask himself the one question his lawyers had never prepared him for. Harlan Voss was 53 years old and worth somewhere between $340 million and $400 million, depending on which quarter you asked and how honest his accountants were feeling. He'd grown up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the second son of a pipe fitter who drank too much and a school librarian who read everything. They weren't poor, not technically, but they were the kind of family that felt the distance between comfortable and desperate every time something broke. The car, the furnace, the dishwasher, whatever broke next in the rotation of things that always, eventually, broke. Harlan had been sharp from the beginning. Not loud smart, not show-off smart, the quiet kind that shows up in test scores and the way a kid stares at a problem slightly longer than everyone else. He got into the University of Oklahoma on merit, graduated near the top of his class, spent 3 years at a mid-size investment firm in Dallas learning how money moved before he understood it completely. By 29, he'd scraped together $85,000 in personal savings and started Voss Capital Partners out of a 1-bedroom apartment with a folding table for a desk and a phone that rang so rarely he'd sometimes check to make sure it was still working. He built it slowly, methodically, deal by deal, handshake by handshake, always watching, always listening, always keeping his cards pressed against his chest, because the one time he hadn't, it had cost him everything. He was 26 when it happened. His college roommate, a guy named Craig, who'd been the best man at a wedding that never happened, had convinced Harlan to co-invest in a small commercial property in Fort Worth. Harlan had put in $60,000, every dollar he'd saved since graduation. Craig had the connections, the pitch, the paperwork. Harlan had trusted him completely because trust was something he gave easily back then, the way young men do before the world teaches them the price. Craig withdrew the funds, dissolved the LLC, and moved to Phoenix without a phone call. Harlan found out from a property tax notice addressed to a company that no longer existed. He'd spent 6 months trying to recover the money legally before a lawyer told him, quietly and without ceremony, that he'd have better luck expecting snow in July. He never talked about it publicly. Privately, it calcified into something permanent. A rule that sat beneath every contract, every partnership, every hire he made for the next 27 years. Verify everything. Trust the documents, not the person. Everyone has a motive. Find it before they use it on you. He wasn't cruel. That mattered to him in whatever accounting he kept. He paid his people well, maintained his properties, settled disputes without litigation when he could. But he operated behind a pane of glass, present, visible, and completely unreachable. His daughter, Lena, was 24 years old and finishing her first year of law school at Georgetown. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a relationship with Harlan that had been fraying at the edges since the divorce 8 years ago. Their calls were short, transactional, scheduled. They talked about school and logistics and the weather in D.C., the way two people talk when they've run out of safe topics and are too tired to try the unsafe ones. The last real conversation they'd had, the one that still sat in Harlan's chest like an untreated bruise, had been on her 21st birthday. He'd called with a $10,000 transfer and a 5-minute voicemail. She'd called back and said, very calmly, the way she said everything, "Dad, you know I don't need your money, right? I just need you to actually be somewhere sometimes. Not a wire transfer. From you." He hadn't known what to say, so he'd said he'd try. He'd meant it in the moment, the way people mean things they have no practical roadmap for. He was still working on the roadmap. On a Tuesday in late October, Harlan checked out of the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Nashville. He'd been there 2 nights for a regional development conference. The briefcase was in his room. He knew it the moment he handed the valet his parking ticket and felt the absence of the weight he'd carried for 2 days. He didn't go back immediately. That was the part his assistant could never quite understand later. The fact that he'd stood at the valet stand, doing mental inventory for nearly a full minute, and then gotten in the car anyway. He had meetings in Memphis by noon. He told himself the hotel would secure it, that he'd call from the road, that the briefcase was locked, that no one would get in. He called his assistant 20 minutes south on I-65 and asked her to contact the hotel. She did. The front desk told her the room had been checked out and cleaned. No briefcase had been turned into lost and found. Harlan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed flat. "Find out who cleaned the room. Get me a name." His assistant called back in 4 minutes. The name was Corinne Sylvester. She'd been employed by the hotel's housekeeping department for 6 years. She was scheduled off at 2. "I need the hotel manager on the phone," Harlan said. He had already decided what had happened. Corinne Sylvester was 41 years old and had been cleaning rooms at the Meridian Grand since her son was in 2nd grade. He was in 8th grade now, which meant 6 years of 6 a.m. shifts, 6 years of loading a cart before most of the city had made coffee, 6 years of invisible work in rooms where people left behind their worst versions of themselves and expected to return to a reset. She was not bitter about it. That was important to understand, not as a performance of contentment, but as a practical fact. She'd grown up in Clarksville, Tennessee, an hour north, the youngest of 4 kids raised by a single mother, who worked 2 jobs and still found time to sit at the kitchen's table every night and ask each of her children what they'd learned that day. Corinne had learned, from watching her mother, that dignity was not something work gave you or took away. You brought it with you, every day, into every room. Her husband, Marcus, and she still thought of him as Marcus sometimes, even though his name wasn't on anything anymore, had walked out 5 years ago on a Saturday morning while their son, Calvin, was at his cousin's birthday party. He'd taken his clothes, his guitar, and $2,300 from the joint checking account. Left a note that said he needed to find himself. Corinne had read the note twice, folded it neatly, put it in the kitchen drawer, and gone to pick Calvin up from the birthday party. She did not fall apart. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because Calvin came home that afternoon with birthday cake on his shirt and showed her a trick he'd learned with a yo-yo, and she'd realized, watching him, that the floor was still there. The apartment was still there. Her job was still there. And whatever grief she carried, she'd carry it after he was asleep. Calvin was 13 now, quiet kid, serious about things that mattered to him, obsessed with robotics since his school had started an after-school program 2 years back. He placed 4th in a regional competition in March, which, as far as Corinne was concerned, was the same as winning. She told him so every time it came up. She was supporting the 2 of them on $14.20 an hour. 6 years in, the hotel had given her a $1.80 raise and a certificate of appreciation that was still in the same drawer as Marcus's note. She supplemented with weekend shifts when the hotel was booked for conferences, which it frequently was, and she'd picked up a few hours at a laundromat on Thursday evenings, folding and bagging for drop-off customers at $11 an hour under the table. Calvin's insulin cost $290 a month. He'd been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 9. And the 2 years since had been a masterclass in the specific anxiety of a parent who manages a medical condition without the financial cushion to absorb anything going wrong. She had insurance through the hotel, basic. But it capped out on specialty medications and left her with out-of-pocket costs that didn't flinch at her circumstances. She owed $8,400 to the hospital from his diagnosis hospitalization, paid in monthly installments of $200, which meant 42 months of $200 before the debt would clear, assuming nothing else happened. Something always happened. Her car was a 2006 Dodge Caravan with a cracked dashboard, a heater that worked on the driver's side only, and a check engine light she'd stopped reading because the mechanic had told her it was 3 different things and she could only afford to fix one of them at a time. The front left tire had a slow leak she'd been topping off every 4 days at the gas station 2 blocks from the hotel. She was in room 412 at 11:40 that morning when she found the briefcase. It was on the closet shelf, pushed back, partially hidden by a dry cleaning bag that had been left on the hook. Standard checkout miss. She'd found a Rolex in a sock drawer once, and a passport tucked under a mattress, and a hearing aid in a drinking glass that she'd been certain had been thrown away by accident. People left things. She returned them, every time, without exception, because that was the rule she'd been raised under, and the rule she raised Calvin under, and the rule that, as far as she could tell, was the closest thing to a guarantee she'd found in 41 years. The briefcase had a 3-digit combination lock on the clasp, but the lock hadn't been spun after the last use. It opened on the second try. She opened it only because she needed to find identification. That was what she told herself. And it was true. The MacBook was there. The business card was there. And the money was there. She counted it the way she counted everything. Carefully, methodically, twice. $180,000. $60,000 per bundle, 3 bundles, held in rubber bands with a precision that suggested the person who'd assembled them was accustomed to handling cash in amounts she couldn't imagine being accustomed to. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, the hum of the hallway beyond the door, the sound of a cart rolling past. Fluorescent light in the bathroom casting a pale rectangle across the carpet. $180,000. Calvin's insulin for 51 years. The hospital debt gone with room to spare. A new car. A deposit on an actual house with a yard. Something she'd stopped letting herself picture, because picturing things you can't reach starts to feel like self-harm after a while. She sat with it. Then she closed the briefcase, locked the combination to a random number, finished making the bed, and went to report it at the front desk. The shift manager, a young man named Phil who wore his tie slightly too tight and took himself extremely seriously, had looked at the briefcase and then at Corinne with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Somewhere between impressed and suspicious, as if her honesty itself required an explanation. "I'll take it to the manager's office," he said. "I'd like a receipt," Corinne said, saying I turned it in. Phil had blinked at that. She knew why she asked. If $180,000 went missing from a manager's office, she didn't want her name to be the last one holding it. She'd learned that lesson years ago from her mother, who'd once cleaned an office and returned a gold bracelet and spent 2 weeks being looked at sideways until the bracelet was confirmed found. Sometimes doing the right thing wasn't enough. You had to do it with documentation. Phil had written the receipt by hand. Briefcase containing documents and personal items, turned in by Corinne Sylvester, room 412, 11:52 a.m. He'd signed it. She'd taken a photo of it with her phone. She was 3 rooms down, stripping the sheets from a king bed, when she heard the shift manager's voice in the hallway. He was on his phone, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. "We have it in the office." The housekeeper turned it in. A pause. Corinne Sylvester. 6 years. No incidents. Another pause. Longer. "Understood, Mr. Voss." Corinne folded the sheets into a tight square and put them on the cart. She went back to work. What Harlan found when he arrived at the hotel 2 hours later was a briefcase that had been secured, a manager who was aggressively apologetic, and a $500 cash reward sitting in an envelope with his name on it, ready to be handed to the housekeeper. He took the briefcase. He verified the contents. Everything was there. The money, the laptop, the documents inside that he hadn't mentioned to anyone because they concerned a real estate acquisition that wasn't yet public knowledge. He asked to speak to the employee who'd turned it in. Corinne Sylvester appeared in the manager's office 5 minutes later, still in her work uniform, hair pulled back, the kind of compose that comes from years of not having the luxury of being otherwise. Harlan held out the envelope. "For your honesty," he said. Corinne looked at the envelope, then at him. "No, thank you, sir." Harlan had been in negotiation rooms for 25 years. He knew every variety of refusal, the strategic, the theatrical, the negotiating upward. This wasn't any of those. She said it the way someone states the temperature outside. A fact with no drama attached. "You turned in $180,000, Harlan said. "It wasn't mine to keep. That's not how most people see it." She met his eyes for the first time. "I'm not most people, and neither is my son." He didn't know what to say to that. In 25 years of business, across hundreds of conference tables and thousands of negotiations, Harlan Voss had not once been left without a response. He stood there holding the envelope while she thanked the manager and walked back out to finish her shift. He drove to Memphis with the briefcase in the back seat and the image of that conversation in his head. Sitting there like a splinter, he couldn't locate precisely enough to remove. Over the next 3 days, Harlan did something he almost never did. He asked questions about a person that had nothing to do with business. He called the hotel manager. Not to complain, to ask about Corinne Sylvester. Not from surveillance, not from any system that crossed a line. Simply what was available to a man who owned the building the hotel occupied and had a friendly relationship with the management group. What he learned sat in his chest in a way that financial data never did. 6 years of clean employment. Not one disciplinary note. A receipt she'd asked for in writing before handing over $180,000. A son with type 1 diabetes being raised alone. A car with a slow leaking tire and a broken heater. A hospital debt paid in the smallest installments that still technically counted as paying. And a comment the shift manager had made, almost offhand. "She's been trying to get into the hotel's supervisor training program for 2 years. Gets passed over every cycle. I think it's budget. Might be something else." Harlan knew what something else sometimes meant in hospitality. He'd spent enough time in buildings to know the distance between the people who owned them and the people who kept them running. He thought about the briefcase, about what $180,000 could mean to someone carrying $8,400 in hospital debt and $290 a month insulin, and a car that required manual tire inflation every 4 days just to stay on the road. He'd built a $340 million business on the principle that everyone had a motive, and your job was to find it before they used it on you. He'd been so certain, in that moment on I-65 when he'd first heard the room had been cleaned, what had happened. So certain he'd asked for a name before the call was finished. He'd been wrong, and not slightly wrong. Completely, foundationally, 180 degrees wrong. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk. Not his mother. He'd lost her when he was 34. A heart attack that came fast and left no room for proper goodbyes. It was a photograph of Lena at 12, standing outside the Oklahoma State Library in a dress their mother had ironed for the occasion. Because Lena had won a Young Readers Award and wanted everything to be exactly right. She was holding the certificate with both hands, smiling like the world was a reasonable place to live in. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 weeks. Not because anything had happened. Simply because nothing had, and the distance had become a groove they both kept slipping into without meaning to. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He didn't call Lena. Not yet. Instead, he drove back to Nashville. He found Corinne in the parking structure at 2:15 in the afternoon, loading her cart equipment into the back of the Dodge Caravan. The front left tire was visibly low. She was wearing a jacket that was too thin for the drop the temperature had taken overnight. She saw him and went, still. "Mr. Voss, I'm not here to offer you money," Harlan said. "I want to be clear about that up front, because the last time I was here I handled it wrong, and I know it." She waited. "I had you wrong from the beginning. When I found out the briefcase was missing, the first thing I did was ask for your name. I'd already decided what had happened before I knew anything about you. That's something I need to say out loud." Corinne looked at him with the same steady patience she gave the rest of her work. "People assume things," she said. "I've had practice with it. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." The parking structure hummed around them. A car reversed out of a space 2 rows over. Someone laughed on a phone call somewhere near the elevator. My son is 13, Harlan said. Lena. She's 24. At Georgetown. He stopped. Reorganized. I have a daughter. She's 24. I've been disappointing her in small ways for 8 years because I don't know how to be in a room without an agenda, without a motive I'm managing. Corinne said nothing. You asked for a receipt, Harlan said, before you handed over $180,000. You protected yourself because you knew you'd be the one suspected if it went missing later. My mother taught me that, she said. What did she teach you? Corinne considered for a moment. That doing the right thing isn't a performance. It doesn't need an audience. But it does need a paper trail sometimes because the world is the world. Harlan stood with that for a moment. Then he said, I want to offer you something that isn't money. Or not just money. She looked at him. The hotel is part of a property group I have a majority stake in. The Facilities Management Division has a training pathway for supervisory roles that most of the frontline staff don't know exists because it's never been communicated properly. I want to make sure you have access to it, not as charity. As correction, you've been passed over for 2 cycles on a program you should have been in from the start. You checked, she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I did. I should have asked first. I'm asking now. Can I tell you the rest? She leaned against the van and crossed her arms, not closed, thinking. Go ahead. Calvin's insurance situation. I know you have coverage through the hotel. I know where it gaps. I can correct those gaps through the benefits program without it costing you anything additional. The insulin cost should come down by at least $200 a month. Maybe more. She looked away. He saw her throat move. There's a partial scholarship fund through the property group for dependents of long-term employees. Calvin qualifies. It doesn't cover everything, but it covers the kind of things that fall through the cracks. Robotics competitions, equipment, school fees. She turned back. Why? Her voice was careful, the same tone you use when you're deciding whether to open a door. Because I was built by Craig, Harlan said. A person I trusted who walked away with my money and left me with a rule that said everyone has a motive. And I've used that rule for 27 years as armor. But armor is only useful against an enemy. And you're not an enemy. You're a person who found $180,000 and handed it back and asked for a receipt so no one could pin it on you later. That's not a motive. That's character. Corinne was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a second car moved through the structure and disappeared. Calvin has a tournament in March, she said. Regional robotics. He placed 4th last year. What would first place take? A team, better parts, transportation that doesn't need tire inflation every 4 days. Harlan nodded. Call me next week. I'll have my assistant set it up. All of it. He held out a card. She took it, looked at it, front and back, the way she looked at the receipt she'd asked for in the manager's office. One condition, Corinne said. Harlan waited. You call your daughter? He blinked. I'm a mother raising a son alone. I can spot a person who's run out of excuses not to pick up the phone. She folded his card and put it in her jacket pocket. Call her, tonight, not tomorrow. Harlan drove back to his hotel in Memphis that evening in a silence that felt different from the silences he was used to. Not empty. Just open. The way a room feels after the furniture's been moved and before anything new has been brought in. He called Lena at 9:17 p.m. She answered on the 3rd ring, the cautious kind of answer, the one that means I'm picking up because I'm not sure I should be. Dad? Hey. He stopped. Started again. I met someone this week. Not like that. A woman who works at a hotel I own property in. She found something of mine worth a lot of money and gave it back without hesitation. And then she said something I haven't been able to put down. What did she say? She said doing the right thing doesn't need an audience. It needs a paper trail sometimes, because the world is the world. Pause. I've been building paper trails for 27 years and using them as a reason not to trust anyone. I don't think that's what she meant. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, who is she? A housekeeper. Single mom. Kid with type 1 diabetes. Works harder than anyone I pay 10 times as much, and she gave the money back, without blinking. Another silence, softer than the ones before it. "What are you going to do?" Lena asked. "I already did part of it. I want to do better by her than I did by you for a while there." She let me say that out loud. He heard Lena breathe, the particular quiet of a person deciding how much to let in. "Okay," she said finally. "Tell me what happened, from the beginning," and Harlan told her. Not like a CEO summarizing an incident report. Like a father telling his daughter a story about a woman who'd reminded him what it cost to be the kind of person worth trusting. He told her about the briefcase and the parking structure and the tire that was always low and the receipt she'd asked for before handing over the kind of money that could change a life. He told her about Craig, which he'd never told her before. He told her about the rule he'd built in the aftermath and carried for so long he'd stopped noticing it was a rule and started thinking it was just truth. He talked for 40. It was the longest phone call they'd had in 3 years. When he finished, Lena said, "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet. She has a son who competes in robotics, Dad. I do intellectual property law. That's literally my world." Harlan almost smiled. "Almost, I know. Set it up," Lena said. "All of it, and next time don't wait 6 weeks. "I won't," he said, and this time he had a roadmap. The following spring, Calvin Sylvester's robotics team placed second at the Tennessee State competition. Corinne stood in the bleachers of a high school gymnasium in Knoxville, with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and tears she refused to let fall until they announced the score, and Calvin looked up at the stands and found her face in the crowd, and she let them fall then, all of them, because he'd earned everyone. Harlan was in a different city that weekend, but his assistant had confirmed the registration fees, the transportation, the upgraded components for the team's build. And tucked in Calvin's equipment bag, placed there by Corinne the night before, was a handwritten note she'd written on the back of a hotel receipt. Character is not built in the moments people see. It's built in the moments they don't. You already know this. I just wanted to write it down. Corinne was enrolled in the supervisory training program by February. She completed the first module while Calvin was at robotics practice on Thursday evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a study guide and a cup of tea that went cold every time she got absorbed in something interesting, which was often. Lena visited Nashville in April. She and Corinne met for the first time at the hotel, not in the manager's office, but in the lobby, where Lena had been waiting for 20 minutes before Corinne's shift ended, and had spent the time reading a brief on her laptop and drinking the hotel's complimentary coffee, which she rated, unprompted, as acceptable. They talked for an hour in the lobby cafe, about Calvin and about Georgetown, and about the particular loneliness of being someone who's always had to be more capable than the situation warranted. About what it meant to raise a kid alone, and what it meant to be raised by someone who did that without complaint. About the specific kind of love that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have time to. When Corinne got up to leave, Lena stood and said, "My dad said you told him to call me. That night." "I did. Thank you." Corinne looked at her for a moment. "He was ready. I just pointed at the phone." Harlan still drove I-65 through Nashville sometimes on the way to Memphis for the grave he visited every October. His mother had been buried there 17 years ago, and he'd brought flowers every year since, sat on the ground beside the headstone long enough to miss her properly, and then driven back with the radio off because some things needed silence around them. He'd started taking a different route back, one that went through Clarksville. He didn't know exactly why, except that he'd looked it up once and found out that was where Corinne had grown up. That her mother was still there, 73 years old, still in the same house where she'd raised 4 kids on 2 jobs and a kitchen table question asked every night without fail. He'd never stopped. He didn't know the woman. It wasn't his place. But sometimes, driving through, he thought about what it meant to raise someone who would find $180,000 and ask for a receipt instead of a running start. About what kind of daily unspectacular work went into a human being who operated like that. About all the kitchen tables and flashlight homework sessions and quiet corrections that left no record and required no audience and built, over years, the only thing that survives all the rest of it. He thought about the voice that had narrated his life since he was 26. Everyone has a motive. Find it before they use it on you. It was still there. Probably always would be. Some things scar too deep to fully heal. But it was no longer the first voice in the room. And on the better days, and there were more of them now, it wasn't even the loudest one. He pulled back onto the highway and drove south through October air that smelled like dried leaves, and coming winter, the radio low. The window cracked. The photograph of Lena at 12 on the passenger seat where he'd taken to keeping it. He called Lena from the road, the way he always did now. She answered before the second ring.